She washes dishes in a hotel where no one meets the eyes of the staff. He is a billionaire, used to measuring people's worth in numbers. But when she reads aloud to his blind son, unaware of who she is speaking to, the world pauses for a moment. This is not a story about miracles, but about dignity that needs no recognition, and in doing so, changes everything. The morning rush hit the Excelsior like a storm. Polished shoes clicked sharply on marble floors. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of lemon polish, and voices, muted, hurried, buzzed around the lobby like restless bees. Behind the scenes, where the lights were dimmer and the noise softened to the scrape of trays and clatter of dishes, Maisie May Lorenz moved through her familiar battlefield. Her sleeves rolled up, her hands soaked in suds. She scrubbed plates with a steady rhythm, the dull thud of her brushes blending into the background like a heartbeat no one noticed. Her uniform was simple: faded navy shirt, black pants that had seen better days, and shoes scuffed from years of long shifts. Her hair was tied back tightly, strands escaping and damp with sweat. The damp air smelled faintly of soap and bleach, and the constant hum of the industrial dishwasher was a relentless soundtrack. "Faster, Maisie!" A sharp voice cut through the din. The floor manager, a thin man with a permanent frown, paced by, eyes flicking past her like she was invisible. But his words landed heavy, reminding her that in this world she was a shadow, there, but unseen. She didn't look up, didn't meet anyone's gaze. Not because she was shy, but because in this place, looking someone in the eye was like challenging the invisible rules. You kept your head down, you worked harder, and you stayed silent. Her lunchbox sat on a narrow shelf nearby, empty save for a crushed granola bar wrapper. She hadn't had time this morning to eat, and the late breakfast had vanished when the shift began to pile up. The thought of her mother at home, waiting for the medication she couldn't afford, pressed down on her chest like a weight. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to shake off the tight knot of worry. Between tasks, she pulled out a small, worn book from her pocket, a tattered copy of Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. The pages were dog-eared, stained with coffee, edges softened by countless readings. Philosophy had once been a dream. Years ago, she'd sat in NYU lecture halls, hungry for ideas, before life pulled her away, tethered by obligation and loss. The break room was no place for dreams. When the assistant manager peeked in and noticed the book, she scoffed. "You're just a dishwasher, Maisie. Books like that, they're not for people like you." Her tone was clipped, dismissive, but the sting was deeper than words. Maisie bit back the urge to snap. Instead, she simply closed the book, sliding it under a stack of clean plates. She was used to being underestimated. It was the currency of her existence. Later that morning, the hum of the elevator caught her attention. A small boy, blind, his fingers tracing the elevator buttons in search of the right floor, moved cautiously. He bumped into a corner, his steps uncertain. Without thinking, Maisie stepped forward. "Need some help?" Her voice was soft, a gentle invitation. The boy nodded. "I'm looking for the fourth floor." "Come with me," she said, guiding his small hand to the panel. "Here." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. There was a quiet bravery in the way he trusted her, a fragile bridge across worlds that otherwise never met. Near the marble lobby, he clutched a brightly colored children's book. She crouched beside him, peering at the cover. "Would you like me to read it to you?" she asked, a flicker of warmth in her tone. His fingers tightened around the book. "Yes, please." She began reading aloud, her voice a low melody over the murmurs of the hotel. The story unfolded, Animals in faraway forests, heroes on daring quests. And the boy's face softened, his blind eyes lifting as if the words painted pictures only he could see. Before long, a sharp voice interrupted. "You're not allowed to talk to guests like that." A security guard appeared, stern and unyielding. Maisie froze. The warmth of the moment snapped like a brittle twig. The boy blinked up at her, confused. "Why?" "Please, ma'am," the guard said, voice clipped. "This is a private hotel." Maisie glanced at the child, then back at the guard, her hands clenched at her sides. Suddenly, footsteps approached briskly. "Is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to a tall man in a tailored suit. Robert Kingsley, the billionaire tech magnate who owned the Excelsior, appeared calm but commanding. The guard straightened. "This woman was speaking to my son," the man said flatly. Maisie felt her throat tighten as she looked up. The man's gaze was sharp, assessing her like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean any harm. I was just helping," she said, voice steady but small. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, she's nice. She understands words. She didn't get scared." Robert Kingsley's face softened, just a little. He looked at Maisie again, this time with a flicker of something unreadable. "Thank you," he said coolly. "Please, ensure that our staff and guests respect the boundaries." He motioned to the guard. "Make sure she knows her place." Maisie's heart pounded. The weight of the moment settled over her. Kindness was dangerous here. She nodded, swallowed the lump in her throat, and stepped back into the shadows of the kitchen. The day crawled on, each minute heavier than the last. Later, an unexpected summons to human resources. The cold office smelled of polished wood and recycled air. "You breached protocol," the HR manager said flatly, eyes flicking to a file. "Interacting with guests is prohibited. We're considering disciplinary action." Maisie's hands curled into fists. "I was just being human." The manager didn't respond. Days later, an email from Kingsley's office. A personal meeting request. The hotel's lounge was sleek and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the kitchen. Kingsley sat across from Maisie, fingers steepled, studying her. "Why did you do it?" he asked. She took a breath. "Because I know what it's like to be invisible, to be forgotten." He looked away briefly, then back. "You read philosophy." "Once, before life happened." He nodded slowly. "I want to offer you a position, helping with our education initiatives." Maisie blinked. "I'm not for sale." Kingsley's eyes narrowed, a spark of respect flickering. The tension between their worlds was palpable. Later, in a cramped deli, Maisie confided to a friend. "He thinks change is a contract you can buy, but trust isn't something you sign on paper." Meanwhile, Kingsley watched his son more closely, noting how he refused his usual aids. "She waits," the boy whispered one evening. Kingsley felt the first tremors of doubt in his certainty. He sought out Maisie again, this time different. "I understand now," he said quietly. "You didn't ask permission. You acted." Maisie met his gaze steadily. "Then let's start with the school library. Not under your name. Under theirs." For the first time, a door between their worlds cracked open. The story was only beginning. The moment Robert Kingsley left the room after their last conversation, Maisie felt a quiet tension settle in her chest. Not quite relief, not quite fear. The hotel's polished walls seemed to close in tighter than before, the hum of luxury now edged with something sharper. Outside, the city's noise carried on as usual, but inside, the world she had known was tilting. She returned to the kitchen with slow steps, wiping her hands on her apron like a shield. The faces of her co-workers were the same, tired, resigned, but now they seemed more distant, like they were watching a game they didn't know they could join. She found her worn book hidden behind the stacked plates. The edges frayed, the spine creased with the weight of untold stories. It felt heavier in her hands. When she caught a glimpse of the clock, she realized the afternoon break had started. Usually, she would retreat to the small, sterile break room. But today, instead of isolating herself in the cramped space, she stepped out into the warm sunlight that filtered through the hotel's glass facade. The world outside was vast, loud, alive, and she felt both connected and estranged. Her phone buzzed, a message from a friend. "You sure about this? Playing with fire." She stared at it a moment before typing back. "Sometimes fire is the only way to see the stars." Later that day, she was called upstairs, not to the kitchen, but to the executive office suite. The elevator ride was slow, the air thick with the scent of leather and polished wood, and when the doors opened, she stepped into a space that felt alien. Crystal chandeliers reflected shards of light onto walls, adorned with abstract paintings she didn't understand. It was the kind of place where power lived in silence. Kingsley was waiting, standing by the window, staring out at the city skyline. Effuik. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice low. "I've been thinking about what you said, the library. I want to know more." Maisie shifted on her feet, clutching her jacket like armor. "It's not about me or you. It's about giving those kids a chance, a place where they can discover something beyond these walls." Kingsley nodded slowly. "I see that. But changing a system is complicated. It's not just money. It's people, politics, resistance." She met his gaze. "That's why it has to start small, with them. Let them have a space where they're seen, not overlooked." He paused, then gestured toward a sleek table. "I want you to help design the program. Your voice, not just my foundation's name." Maisie's breath caught. This was more than she expected. A real chance, but also a test. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But it has to be authentic, no shortcuts." Over the next week, Maisie found herself in meetings with school administrators, educators, and a handful of parents. The room smelled of coffee and worn textbooks, the walls plastered with colorful student artwork. The conversations were sharp, sometimes dismissive. One parent scoffed, "Who's gonna listen to a dishwasher? This isn't a charity event." Maisie didn't flinch. She looked around and said quietly, "It's not about titles. It's about what these kids need." The tension rippled through the room like an electric current. Some eyes softened, others narrowed, but she held her ground, steady as the worn pages of her book. Meanwhile, Kingsley watched from the sidelines, his son's happiness tethered to this new spark of hope. The boy's usual silence was replaced with stories about the woman who read to him. "She makes the words come alive," he told his father. One evening, Kingsley found himself standing alone in his study, the city lights flickering below. The man who had measured life in data and deals felt something new stirring, a crack in his certainty. For once, the world wasn't just about control. It was about connection. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Maisie. Let's talk. When they met again, the conversation was different, less guarded, more real. Maisie spoke about her dreams, her fears, and the invisible lines that kept people like her out. Kingsley listened. For the first time, he didn't offer solutions. He simply heard. As days turned to weeks, the project took shape. A modest library makeover, new books, reading sessions, and a growing group of volunteers who believed in the cause. One afternoon, as Maisie helped arrange shelves, a mother approached her hesitantly. "I was wrong," she said softly. "I thought this was just a rich man's whim. But you've changed things." Maisie smiled, a quiet strength in her eyes. "Change doesn't come from money. It comes from people." That night, as she walked home through the city streets, the lights shimmered with a new promise. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and opposition, but also possibility. And somewhere inside her, a seed of hope was growing, one that no amount of hardship could extinguish. The sun was dipping low over the city skyline, painting the windows of the Excelsior in hues of gold and rose. Inside the newly refurbished school library, the air buzzed quietly, not with noise, but with a kind of hopeful energy. Rows of shelves bore fresh books, their spines gleaming under soft lighting, and a small group of children sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, their faces alive with curiosity. Maisie stood near the entrance, watching. The boy, the same one whose small hand she had guided months before, sat in the center, a book open in his lap. His fingers traced the raised letters on the page, and his face lit with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. Nearby, parents whispered among themselves, some skeptical, others quietly amazed. The air was thick with change, though not everyone welcomed it. "People said no one would listen," Maisie said quietly to a volunteer, a woman folding her arms and nodding. "They called it a fad, a rich man's vanity project." The woman's eyes held a steady warmth. But you didn't give up." Maisie's lips pressed into a firm line. "Because these kids deserve more than invisible walls." Outside the school, news cameras had begun to appear. A journalist approached Maisie, microphone poised. "How did this all start?" Maisie glanced around, seeing the children, the parents, and the small community that had gathered. "A woman reading a book," she said simply. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Meanwhile, Robert Kingsley watched an interview from his office. The billionaire, once defined by numbers and power, listened as Maisie spoke of trust, dignity, and the quiet strength of those overlooked. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, a rare softness in his eyes. Back in the hotel, the Excelsior had quietly shifted. Staff no longer moved like ghosts. The management had introduced empathy training, encouraging small acts of kindness and respect. The polished marble floors still gleamed, but beneath the surface, something had changed. One evening, as Maisie passed the hotel lobby, she didn't look back. The weight of old invisibility lifted, replaced by a calm certainty. She found herself at the community library, a place familiar yet transformed by new possibilities. Sitting with a group of children, she opened a worn book and began to read aloud, her voice steady, rich with the power of stories shared and heard. Later, the boy from before approached, his hand extending a book toward her. "This is for you," he said softly. "You're my voice now." Maisie's eyes shimmered, the gesture quiet but profound. Invited to speak at a panel on education, she stood firm when offered a fee. "Invested in the library," she said. "Let the stories be bigger than me." Her hand brushed the cover of her old philosophy book. With a steady pen, She wrote a simple line on the inside page before passing it along. You don't have to be seen to matter. The room fell silent as those words settled between them, an unspoken truth carried forward by a woman who had once been invisible, but now stood as a quiet beacon of change.